self-destruct system has been activated. The ship will self-destruct in 20 minutes. Option to override self-destruct expires in 10 minutes.
Parkinson's disease
is today's topic, but this conversation goes deeper. It's about the damage, degeneration,
and destruction
of neurons, and most importantly, how to protect these little spaceships in the vast galaxy of your brain. Welcome aboard, USS Brain Shaman. Your captain for today is Dr. Ken Sharlin. Today, let's talk about Parkinson's disease. We might touch on other neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's, ALS, MS, all of which you are helping people with. You've been doing this for many years, previously as a conventionally trained doctor, and now still using all that knowledge and those tools. But now you've also got into functional medicine, and you're kind of blending the two together, helping people with Parkinson's and some of these other neurological conditions. So before we get into the tools and the tactics and conventional medicine versus functional medicine, let's focus in on what is Parkinson's, what is going on in the body, in the brain.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me on the podcast, Michael. I'm looking forward to our conversation. It's very timely that you're asking. I just got back this Sunday night from the International Congress of Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorders, which is the preeminent, largest single gathering globally of researchers and clinicians and various other industry people to get updated on what's going on with Parkinson's. There's things that are just sort of review, how do you approach Parkinson's from the earliest to the latest stages? And then we get into a lot of science and emerging treatments and so forth. So it was a very exciting time. I think really on the cusp of seeing some major breakthroughs in Parkinson's, and yet at the same time, there's a lot of knowledge out there that unfortunately does not get utilized nearly often enough. And much of that is in the functional and lifestyle medicine arena. So just at the very basics, if I say Parkinson's, a lot of people think tremor, right? Is that kind of what comes to mind? Or maybe somebody with a sort of a stooped posture and shuffling gait, and often they sort of have a lack of facial expression. They may have trouble speaking clearly. And then there are a variety of other symptoms that we may refer to as the non-motor symptoms. So all the things I've already mentioned have something to do with movement. And yet people with Parkinson's can have anxiety. They can have drops in their blood pressure when they go from laying to standing. They may have, for men, sexual dysfunction. That's not to say women can't either, but men often experience erectile dysfunction. Constipation is unfortunately a very major problem and an important one to recognize and ask about. And part of that is because although sort of by word association, if I say Parkinson's, you think of all those movement things. In fact, much like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's has what we would call a premotor phase, meaning that the changes that ultimately manifest as this movement disorder may be evolving over 10 or 20 years before the person even develops symptoms. And those symptoms that they're noticing may on the surface seem much less specific and not necessarily, like, oh my gosh, I'm getting Parkinson's. Like, I'm a doctor, and unfortunately, people have difficulty going to the bathroom. And so, a lot of people say I struggle with constipation. It doesn't necessarily automatically mean that they're getting Parkinson's, but it is a very common problem in Parkinson's. And retrospectively, it's really a telltale sign that they were developing that for a long period of time. Often there are other things such as change in mood, often anxiety, depression. There may be something called REM sleep behavioral disorder. And that you can think of the person either doing something as simple as talking in their sleep, but they may be acting out their dreams. And I've seen people who thought that they were sort of like World War II flying aces and taking a nosedive off the end of the bed, or getting so active and so violent in their sleep that their bed partner has to go sleep in another room, or at least in a separate bed, in order to even get a good night's sleep. And if these things are happening at the same time, whether or not they have that change in posture or shuffling gait, that is almost certainly a person developing Parkinson's. So it is a very big problem. It has a long trajectory. There's also very often a loss of taste and smell that heralds the onset of Parkinson's. And yet, despite the fact that we know so much about what's going on in and around the brain and this sort of long trajectory, we don't yet have treatments on the conventional side that either prevent the person from developing the disease in the first place, or slowing the progression or reversing the disease trajectory at this time. There is no FDA approved treatment in the United States that does any of that. All the treatments, and there are a remarkable number of treatments, are focused on improving the symptoms, but they don't address the cause.
Okay, so how do they address the symptoms? I know this is not what we want to do. We want to actually fix the problem, but
Right.
we will get to, getting to the underlying causes. But yeah, first, what is this sort of conventional neurology approach to Parkinson's? What were you doing before you discovered all functional medicine stuff?
So yeah, and so it's worth also mentioning that my most recent work, I've always, you mentioned things like Alzheimer's, ALS, MS, and I still do all of that stuff. But it seems more from my research, thought leadership, speaking, writing, all those things. I've had years where we spent put a little more focus on other disease processes, go around giving talks about MS, but we've been doing a lot of work lately on Parkinson's. But what's interesting is that there's not a single diagnostic test as well where, if it's abnormal, you would definitively say this is Parkinson's and nothing else. There are things that come really close. There are two main tests. One is called a DAT scan. That's sort of short for dopamine transporter. And it's a nuclear medicine scan in which a person with suspected Parkinson's is injected with a radioisotope that tags something called the dopamine transporter, the technology that images the brain once they've been injected with this nuclear medicine tracer is called SPECT, which stands for single photon emission computerized tomography. And if they have a Parkinson's disease like disorder, and I'll qualify that, the SPECT scan or DAT scan is abnormal. It shows decreased uptake of the tracer in a region called the striatum. And that's where the dopamine projections coming from the midbrain, the nerve cell projections that are sending out dopamine, are aiming, if you will. So we know that Parkinson's, among the many ways that it can be described, is a disease in which there's loss of dopamine producing cells at a part of the base of the brain called the midbrain. Dopamine is one of our several important neurotransmitters that allow our nerve cells to talk with one another. And in the case of Parkinson's, dopamine is critical in a region of the brain that sort of holds the software that allows us to carry out complex movements. So if you're going to walk across the room, there's all kinds of things involved. There's multiple muscles. There's how much tension and length goes in the muscles, which muscles are engaged when and for how long. So it's not like if you're doing a bench press, you're just up, down, right? Very simple movement. But these more complex programs, if you will, are stored in a region of the brain broadly called the basal ganglia, and that has connections to the midbrain through these dopamine projections. And so if the DAT scan is abnormal in the correct context, meaning a history and a physical exam, then that strongly supports the diagnosis of Parkinson's. But it does turn out that other conditions can also affect these dopamine systems. And so, in the abstract, meaning if I didn't see the patient, if I didn't do an exam, if I didn't, go through all of my clinical toolbox, I couldn't look at a DAT scan that's abnormal and say that's definitely Parkinson's versus, say, something called multiple system atrophy. Now, I'm going through that to explain that it's wonderful to talk about functional medicine, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But the reality is that when a person is diagnosed with Parkinson's, we know that they have already lost somewhere between 50 and 80% of their dopamine producing cells. They are not coming back. And so while I definitely understand and embrace the enthusiasm that is functional medicine, and because, people know about me, they want to come work with me, they want to come to the clinic. They're like, "Oh, doctor, I want to be treated naturally. I don't want to take that Levodopa medicine, that drug. I want some other solution for my Parkinson's." And what I explain to them is that, imagine that you're a car aficionado, and you buy a beautiful, fancy, whatever it is, car, a Porsche or whatever, and it's in your garage, and you're showing it to your best friend, and you're like, "Yeah, man, it's a sweet car. How fast does it go? Let's go for a ride." And you're like, "Nah, nope, can't do it because I have no gas in the engine." Like, "What? You got a car like that? No gas in the engine?" Like, "Yeah, no, no." So my point is that if you don't have dopamine in your brain, if you don't have those connections in your basal ganglia, you're not going anywhere. And in fact, you're completely frozen. And if anybody has ever seen the wonderful movie called Awakenings, Robert De Niro and Robin Williams and several other wonderful actors, those individuals had something called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, that they are dopamine responsive. And before the character in the movie, played by Robin Williams, started to experiment with those individuals using this newly discovered levodopa, they were frozen in bed, catatonic. So, yeah, functional medicine is a really important tool in the toolbox, but it's like, if you're frozen, you can't do the things that functional medicine requires. And so, this is a great example of what I would prefer to call integrative neurology, where we have to take the tools of traditional medicine, use the best of the best there, and then bring in the other half of the puzzle, the other half of the equation. And it's that synthesis of both where people really get the best results.
Does all our dopamine ultimately come from the basal ganglia? This might be a naive question, but I know that the basal ganglia is this dopamine center where it's packed full of these dopamine neurons, and in things like Parkinson's and Huntington's and other conditions, these dopamine neurons are dying. But it makes me wonder, are there any other parts of the brain or other ways? It sounds like what you're saying is no, this is the pathway. Yeah, is it the dopamine center?
What is the critical dopaminergic pathway that drives those programs, those software programs of movement? Now, we have other parts of the brain, or other, like your gut has dopamine receptors, and you do produce dopamine in your digestive tract. And that's really important to know. We'll get to that, why that's super important from a Parkinson's perspective. But for example, in the disease schizophrenia, we know, and there's many ways of looking at things. We talk about chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. So there's sort of it's not a joke, because we never make jokes about diseases. There's nothing funny about having a disease like that, but it's kind of an expression, and it's used in functional psychiatry, where they talk about you know depression is not a Prozac deficiency. What they're saying by that is, the drug Prozac or fluoxetine is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And it's been known for a long time that if you increase the availability of serotonin in certain regions of the brain, that it improves mood. It is certainly not the only tool in the toolbox to help people with depression. And there are many issues with, management of depression solely with those kind of drugs. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, looking at things from just purely a neurotransmitter perspective is helpful when we're making certain arguments about what we want to do, but there is more going on than that. So in your frontal lobes, you have dopamine, and people who have schizophrenia, that's one of the factors that plays into schizophrenia. But they may have overactive dopamine activity in the frontal lobe, and that's why they have things like hallucinations and delusions. And that's also why, when in more advanced cases of Parkinson's, the treatment, the gold standard treatment, which is to give somebody a compound called levodopa, what Robin Williams was giving in that movie, which is converted to dopamine in the brain. If you get too much dopamine stimulation in the frontal lobes, well, you get sort of a psychosis. You get the hallucinations and delusions and agitation as if somebody is schizophrenic. So that touches on your question, like, where else in the brain is dopamine involved? But ultimately, we can only either have our own dopamine that our brains are producing, where the connections are directly between the midbrain and the region of the brain called the basal ganglia, or we take a drug called levodopa, which goes under the trade name Sinemet. And if you ever look at a prescription for Sinemet, what you'll see are two compounds there. One is called L-dopa or levodopa, and the other is called carbidopa. And there's a lot of misconception by the general public as to what's going on there. Because again, and kind of talking to your audience, a lot of folks are looking for natural solutions. But it turns out that levodopa is really one of the most natural drugs in the industry. We make levodopa in our brains when we eat protein, and we break down that protein into amino acids. And among those amino acids are tyrosine. Also phenylalanine can be used, but mainly tyrosine. And tyrosine is converted to L-dopa, and then L-dopa to dopamine. Again, people who have Parkinson's, they don't have enough of those nerve cells to produce all that dopamine. So it might make sense that, well, okay, well, just give them dopamine then. And the reason you can't do that is because dopamine can't make it across what's called the blood-brain barrier. But L-dopa can. But the caveat, as I mentioned earlier, is that you also have dopamine in your gut. You produce dopamine in your gut the same way that you produce it in your brain. It has a separate role in the gut, but the problem is, if I just pour all this L-dopa into my stomach, if I take a pill and it goes down my esophagus into my stomach, well, if it's just L-dopa, I'll just convert it to dopamine down there, and it won't ever get to my brain. The conversion of L-dopa to dopamine requires an enzyme called dopa decarboxylase. And all this carbidopa in Sinemet is doing is blocking the peripheral, meaning outside the nervous system, blocking the peripheral conversion of L-dopa to dopamine, so that the L-dopa instead can get unaltered, unadulterated, still gets to the brain. And then once it's absorbed by the brain cells, then they can convert it to dopamine. And then, just like in the movie Awakenings and the title itself, boom, they wake up, they can move. And then if you have a therapeutic diet and lifestyle program, that's when they're going to get the most benefit, because, if you can't move, you can't move, right? If you're frozen, you're frozen. And literally, in the worst cases of Parkinson's, people can appear and be completely frozen. And that's a scary problem. Imagine being completely awake and alert and not being able to move.
Do we have any idea on what's causing all this?
So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of layers to this. For example, we've known for a very long time now. It came to my attention very recently. I have a colleague who's helping me produce our Parkinson's Solution Summit, and I was talking to her. Her name is Dr. Barbara Pickett. She's a professor of neurology at Michigan State, a movement disorder expert. And she said, humans are the only species that gets Parkinson's. Like, there are other diseases that affect animals. I've had pets all my life, and tragically, sometimes old dogs, for example, get kind of demented, but only humans develop Parkinson's. So it's very interesting. So there's something about our biology, But also, we know that there's a strong tie with the Industrial Revolution. If we look at the history of Parkinson's, and James Parkinson sort of wrote the treatise that eventually, the disease itself was named after him. But in fact, before the shaking palsy treatise was written, Parkinson's was described, for hundreds of years. I mean, in the days of Leonardo da Vinci, there were descriptions of Parkinson's. However, we think and we know that the incidence, and this means the rate of new cases, the incidence of Parkinson's, if we plot that on a graph over time, we would see a very sharp rise that is coincident with the rise in industrialization globally. So we think that the environment, we think that chemicals like pesticides, herbicides, more recently a compound called trichloroethylene, which is really ubiquitous from being used as an industrial lubricant to dry cleaning to being used in household chemicals and even personal care products. And your skin is your biggest organ, and you're basically dousing your skin in trichloroethylene. You're increasing your risk about fivefold of developing Parkinson's. So those environmental pollutants as well as air pollution play major roles. There are other risk factors, chronic head injury. Brent Favre, and I apologize to the folks who are diehard football fans, so I don't watch a lot of football, but Brent Favre from, I think, Green Bay Packers, retired quarterback, right, was just on the news a week or two ago saying he had Parkinson's. So, football's a great game, but head injury, right, over and over and over. Our veterans around blasts, right, or talking about environmental things, the burn pits of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So definitely environmental exposures, traumatic brain injury, and all of the environmental stuff, the chemicals, pesticides, they all seem to play a major role.
Yeah. You mentioned that once our basal ganglia is basically has no gas in the engine, we gotta maybe take L-Dopa in order to get it. And you also said that this condition progresses over decades. It's sort of in the works before we may or may not notice it. So with that all in mind, what are some things we could do to, one, recognize, oh crap, something's happening? It sounds like the constipation maybe comes later. I don't know. But what are some things they could do, things that they can do to change their environment? Are there any lifestyle type things, such as food or exercise or anything like that would help with all this?
Certainly there is. And yes, the constipation component, well, that unfortunately, gut issues, and you're doing podcasts and, talking to thought leaders in the arena of functional medicine, many, if not perhaps 100%, talk about gut health. So certainly many people suffer from imbalances in gut function. And the constipation actually does come earlier. But if it's really the spectrum of, if you're losing your sense of smell or taste, if you are experiencing constipation, if you're having, these very active dreams, those sorts of constellations of presentations very well may mean that the person is evolving Parkinson's disease. So that is something to watch out for. Just on the note of gut health, we do know that there appear to be changes in the gut microbiome that herald the onset of Parkinson's and are associated with having Parkinson's disease. There are several papers on this. There are some patterns that are somewhat consistent, but not enough to really say definitively it's this bacteria or it's this bacteria. Although there have been studies of, there's a particular probiotic that has been studied specifically to help people with Parkinson's, and it is available commercially through a company called Bened Life. And So clearly there are certain patterns, but there's enough diversity in the papers that are published. I don't really feel comfortable telling you it's this bacteria and not this bacteria because it could be the opposite, in papers. But we definitely know there are shifts there. We know that a protein that is associated with Parkinson's pathology called alpha synuclein that under light microscopes has been labeled a Lewy body, these Lewy bodies of Parkinson's and Lewy body disease, which is a overlapping but possibly separate disease. All are characterized by these Lewy bodies, which are composed of alpha synuclein, but they're not found just in the brain. They're found in the gut, they're found in the skin. And there's some evidence that these shifts in the microbiome and the accumulation of this alpha synuclein, maybe because of inflammatory changes in the gut, eventually find their way to the brain, perhaps along the vagus nerve. So here we are talking about holistic solutions, and not surprisingly, health starts in the gut once again. So we should focus on gut health for sure, and very often we associate gut health with diet. And so diets that are high in the plant compounds, polyphenols, flavonoids, those have been shown to be neuroprotective when it comes to Parkinson's disease. The diets, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's, MS, ALS, may be slightly different, but generally speaking, we want to be aiming for those diets that are primarily plant-based, not necessarily exclusively, but eating lots of colors, lots of greens, lots of the cruciferous vegetables. And then, here in the US, we're a meat and potatoes society. We need to ditch our emphasis on all those potatoes. Not that you can't ever eat potatoes, of course. And even the meat should be almost like, okay, that's my side, that's not my main, the size of your palm sort of thing. But focus on a primarily plant-based diet with lots of colors, and of course good hydration, and get your gut working well, and limit the exposure to things that quickly become sugar. Does everybody need to be gluten free? Well, it certainly has very little nutritional value. So I certainly encourage people to follow an elimination diet initially, and then they can explore whether or not they're going to reintroduce some of the things that they've eliminated, one at a time, to sort of see how they react. So diet, gut health, hand in hand. Um, but it turns out that if we only focus on one of the lifestyle factors and not in some way over time have a commitment to improving sleep or exercise, which is very effective in Parkinson's, or our stress response system, we're going to have problems. We're not really going to make as much progress on that as we would ultimately like to make. But a great place to start, the inroad that everyone easily focuses on, really, because we all like to eat, is food, right? Follow an anti-inflammatory diet, and right there, you're putting yourself on a better trajectory to improve the Parkinson's symptoms and hopefully the underlying pathology as well.
Right, because in your book, The Healthy Brain Toolbox, you highlight two things, inflammation and oxidation, that are big causes to a lot of these neurological problems, including Parkinson's. So, yeah, can you talk more about how these two things, inflammation, I guess we've heard about. Oxidation is something we hear less about. So maybe you can touch on these.
Sure. In many things that we talk about in functional medicine, really the narrative is like the old cliche, too much of a good thing. So, in the short run, inflammation is fine. Inflammation might save your life. Inflammation is really part of what's called the biological stress response, was described by people like Hans Selye and Walter Cannon, a physiologist from Harvard University, who coined the term homeostasis, which means balance. Inflammatory response might mean, you're driving along the highway and they're doing construction ahead and the cars are slowing down, but maybe you're trying to put your favorite, station on the radio. So you're not really paying attention to the cars in front of you. And then suddenly you realize, you're 20 feet away from a car that's come to a near halt and you hit your brakes. And even if you don't have an accident, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your pupils dilate, your breathing gets heavier, even if it's for, a couple of minutes. That's an inflammatory response. That correlates with the release of hormones like epinephrine and cortisol, and all of those things together, maybe that saves your life. We always talk in functional medicine about, if you're being chased by the saber-toothed tiger. But Robert Sapolsky, who's a scientist from Stanford and does a lot of podcast interviews himself, wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he's talking about the stress response, but it's a great image, that zebra that's eating the tall grass, and maybe the lion says, "Oh, that looks like dinner." And the lion, plans his attack, and, but ultimately the lion goes for it. The zebra either gets away or the zebra becomes dinner, and that's okay because that's the circle of life. But if the zebra gets away, it just goes back and eats in the tall grass, right? It doesn't go, "Oh my gosh, I must get eaten by the lion. I must get eaten by the lion." Well, human beings do, right? We tend to ruminate, and Selye studied that in the lab when he put predators and rodents together in a cage where the predator couldn't quite get to the rodent, but the rodents were naturally nearly frightened to death. But he described what was called the general adaptation syndrome, where we go from that acute phase where there's an immediate rise in cortisol and epinephrine to what he called the resistance phase. The first phase was called the alarm phase. I like to call the resistance phase the resilience phase. How long can you handle those stressors before you start breaking down? And then finally, he describes the exhaustion phase, where the systems have failed. There's a new balance, a new homeostasis. We're alive, but we're not functioning very well. And these principles apply to inflammation, meaning that protective inflammatory response, whether that's like the movie Super Size Me, and that gentleman recently died, hopefully unrelated reason, but you eat McDonald's every day for a month, and that triggers an inflammatory response that's way more than your body can handle. So you go from a protective response to a detrimental response, because ultimately this is about the system's biology, where there's a disruption in the balance, and the body can say, "Okay, when are you going to correct the balance?" And you're like, "Well, tomorrow." "Well, I can hang in there till tomorrow." "Okay." And then things normalize, or like, "I'm not sure. Maybe this is going to go on 2 months, 3 months, a year. I'm not sure." And your body's like, "Yeah, but I only have enough reserve for this amount of time." And what happens at the cellular level is we turn on all of these inflammatory signals, all the chemicals that go with it, the hormonal changes, the cytokines, those are inflammation signaling molecules. We call in the white blood cells. We change our production of energy, which we'll get into more in a moment. Those are disruptions, the normal balance, the normal symphony that is our own biology. And then finally, the body says, "That's enough." And it's going to do things like turn on programmed cell death. And it's like hitting the self-destruct button. So I always say I'm an old Trekkie. I'm old enough to say I watched all the episodes of the original Star Trek when I was a kid. And, a theme that runs through sci-fi movies like that is, whether the Enterprise or some other ship, it's under attack by the enemy. They've used up their phasers, their photon torpedoes, their force field, their shield is whatever it's called is failing. And so the captain says, "Okay, everybody get on the little pods, those little ships, and we're going to fly away from the main ship, because the main ship may get destroyed by the enemy, but the other possibility is, if we don't want the enemy to capture our ship, our last resort is we press the button, we blow up the mothership, and it's gone, but we're safe because we're in our life rafts, and the enemy can't steal our technology or whatever, right? So our cells do the same thing. Our cells really do the exact same thing. If all else fails, we can activate programmed cell death in an attempt to sort of save the most important aspect of our existence, our DNA, things like that. So it doesn't necessarily serve us as total human beings, but you could make solid arguments that whether we're talking about Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or ALS, that these are really just maladaptive responses. And I say maladaptive, they're really adaptive responses to these inflammatory threats that we can't make go away. And the only reason I use maladaptive is, again, adaptive sounds like it's okay, we'll just, you go right, I'll go left. But in fact, if they don't serve us as human beings, if you're shuffling along and you can't talk and you have tremor, or you can't remember because you have Alzheimer's, or you can't move your limbs because you have ALS and you're losing all control of muscles, a motor neuron disease. Now, that's pretty terrible. But in fact, these are really responses to these various stressors that is an expression of inflammation. But, there are other pieces of the puzzle, and oxidative stress happens because we breathe air. It's as simple as that. We breathe air, we extract oxygen from the air that we breathe. It travels across the lung tissue into the blood, traveling around, delivering oxygen to all the tissues. That oxygen is absorbed into your cells, where the little batteries of the cell called mitochondria take in oxygen and glucose, fat, or protein. Hopefully not too much protein, because that means you're breaking down your own body. But for those who like the ketogenic diets and all that, they're using fat for fuel. If you eat carbs, use carbs for fuel. Ideally, you should be metabolically flexible. But basically, oxygen, glucose, you go through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and then something called the electron transport chain. And you're making energy that drives all your cellular reactions. But a byproduct of using oxygen to make energy is a free radical. And that is simply a compound that includes an oxygen molecule, where the electrons that are going around the orbiting around the nucleus, that oxygen atom, if you will, where there's an electron that is unpaired. And electrons want to be in pairs. And so when use words like oxidative stress, that simply means that these compounds like superoxides and peroxides and so forth are going around inside your cell going, hey, you willing to give up an electron? You're going to give up an electron? You're going to give up an electron? But, if giving up an electron means damaging your DNA or damaging your mitochondria, that's oxidative stress damage. And so when we use terms like antioxidants, these are simply compounds either that we produce, like glutathione, or that we get through a supplement or food, that are sort of the bucket of water on the fire that say, hey, I'll give up my electron as long as you don't take it from his DNA and start producing DNA damage, which could lead to cancers and, cell death and neurodegeneration and so forth. So we know that mechanism is at play, as well as the inflammation component. There are certainly other things at play as well, but these are just a couple of key mechanisms that I write about in the book.
Why should we not have too much protein? I'm kind of not sure on the whole protein thing. Sometimes I cut it all out and then I have problems, and I'm like, oh, maybe I'm missing B vitamins or something. And then I eat it, and it's really hard question. We all kind of debating it. What's your take on protein? Dig more into that.
Well, there are a couple issues with protein, and so I'm not sure what previous discussions you've had. And the very specific issue of Parkinson's, when people take the drug levodopa carbidopa, otherwise called Sinemet, if they eat a higher protein meal in very close proximity to taking their medication, what happens is, eating is like an on switch for this process that we call digestion, right? Your digestion is at rest between meals or overnight when you have this natural fast because you're sleeping. And then you eat something, and then okay, you start secreting digestive enzymes and bile acids and all those things that aid in digestion. But if you're doing that too, you're also ramping up the production of that peripheral dopa decarboxylase, and that's what converts the L-dopa to dopamine in your gut. So you want to avoid protein close to when you take your medicine, because otherwise you're just converting it to the L-dopa to dopamine in your gut, and it's not getting to your brain. So that's a highly specific practical reason not to avoid protein, but to just be wary of when you're taking your medicine relative to when you're eating. So I tell my patients there's a 3-hour window, 1 hour before, 2 hours after a meal, no cinnamon. So if you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, assuming you're not doing intermittent fasting, that kind of thing, time restricted eating and skipping breakfast. But if you eat breakfast at 8, take your levodopa at 7. If you eat lunch at noon, take your levodopa at 11. If you eat dinner at 5 or 6, take your levodopa at 4 p.m. So that's one issue, right? There are other issues that are more nuanced that have to do with cellular pathways, like what is called the mTOR pathway. And, if you're constantly eating, constantly taking in protein, this sort of keeping that mTOR pathway always on, always active, has associations with a higher risk of developing things like cancer. So protein intake is critical. You need certain amino acids which come from protein are required in our diet. They're essential amino acids. You cannot synthesize them. So we absolutely need to be consuming protein. It doesn't always have to be animal protein. You can get plant protein too, but if you overdo it with protein, you run certain risks as well. There's also issues related to the urea cycle and the production of ammonia. And then, people talk about gout, although there's probably multiple factors related to that. But all of these things play a role. But you do need protein for Parkinson's patients. You just have to time it right.
Yeah. You also mentioned earlier about the dreams, and that kind of got my heart beating because recently I've been having these very vivid dreams and I can remember my dreams. That might be contributed to the fact that I start writing down my dreams, but I don't know. But yeah, what can dreams tell us about Parkinson's? Tell me more about that, and hopefully you can ease my worries that I'm developing Parkinson's.
Yeah, I must say I'm not necessarily a dreams, like an expert on that, but certainly if a person's having REM sleep behavioral disorder, they ought to talk with their doctor. There certainly are other causes, and one of them can be like people who have been through a lot of trauma and suffer from PTSD. We see, veterans who have REM sleep disturbance. Why some of us remember our dreams sometimes, and then other times we don't really remember or don't remember as vivid as they were. And it's like, oh my gosh, so I could, thought I would, when I'm dreaming, like, I don't remember every detail. And then you wake up later and like, it's kind of fuzzy now in my mind. Why that is, I don't know. But, and I'm sure there are other people who are more expert than I in that. But I will say this, that we've talked a little bit about food, and sleep is equally critical. I always start out, when I introduce lifestyle medicine and neurology, I have a phrase that sleep is more than a time of rest. We have to get our sleep 7 or 8 hours. We need all the stages of sleep. Every stage serves a function. And, sleep is a time of repair. Sleep is a time of growth. Sleep is a time of hormone balance, memory consolidation. And now we have all of these tools as consumers to track our sleep and optimize or hack our sleep, as biohackers. I happen to be wearing an Apple Watch. You might have an Oura Ring. Some people have a Samsung watch. It doesn't matter, but take advantage of the technology out there and learn about what's going on with your sleep. And then if there's a problem, figure out if is this something that you can fix yourself? Is it just simply I'm a night owl and I'm on my computer and I'm on my phone and I tend to get really wound up at night rather than creating an environment in which I'm relaxed and ready to go to sleep. There's a old expression related to something called sleep hygiene, where they would say the bed is, the only thing that should be occurring in bed is sleep or sex. And if you are using your bed to fiddle around on your watch and, or your phone and watch TV and all those other things, get up and do that somewhere else. But the point is, you got to get your sleep, and we have huge opportunities to track that. The newest Apple Watch, and not trying to promote that, but they now have the sleep apnea detection, and sleep apnea probably is the number one most significant issue that affects us as humans, that has such an impact on every organ, every tissue, certainly the brain, a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's, a huge risk factor for stroke, a huge risk factor for heart attacks. And, it's kind of a cultural thing that we don't value sleep the way we really should. We don't pay attention. And we certainly, many of us don't bother to track our sleep and get help if we need it. So I would strongly recommend get your data. It's so easy now. See if it's something you can easily address. If it's just a few habits, alcohol late at night, that's another one, right? And get it straightened out, because it's both preventative and it's therapeutic, right? You want to improve your Parkinson's, dial in your sleep. You want to prevent Parkinson's, dial in your sleep. Very, very important.
Yeah, sleep seems to be a major thread through all these mental health conditions, including things like bipolar and schizophrenia, etc. They're not just these brain diseases; they're circadian rhythm diseases, it seems. You've mentioned systems biology, and it's sort of weaved throughout this entire conversation. But let's maybe lay it out. What is systems biology, and how can it help us change our mindset about illness?
Yeah, well, traditionally in medicine, we have the ologists, right? Cardiologist, I'm a neurologist, pulmonologist, so on and so forth, giving us the idea that if you have a digestive problem, you go see the GI person. If you have a brain problem, you see the neuro person like me, and so on and so forth. So we tend to focus on structure. We focus on organ systems, and there's validity to that. If I weren't more of a holistic doctor and you came to me and I was just, your garden variety conventional neurologist, said, Sharlin, I'm having all these digestive issues, gut health, I'd say, go see a GI doctor, right? I can't help you. Like, what? I'm a brain doctor. What? Right. But it both helps us and then sometimes it gets us in trouble, because we are in the age of pharmacotherapeutics, and I'm not ungrateful for that. But on the other hand, you get a pill for this, then it causes a problem over here, and then you have to take another drug to fix that problem. And oh, who's keeping track of the meds? So I see people are 15, 20 different pills. And have you ever sat down with your primary care doctor and sorted out if all of these are actually necessary? Do you still need this stuff? Too many people getting put on acid blocking drugs, omeprazole and all that kind of thing. And we now know that these drugs do all kinds of destructive things to the body if they're used over a long period of time. So the conventional approach has its benefits, but it does have its limits. The systems biology approach, from my perspective, just really comes from functional medicine, says, no, the body is governed by systems, functional meaning physiology, not anatomy, functional systems that really are interdependent. They don't actually operate by themselves, like the way we would separate the GI from the neuro, from the lungs or whatever. And they operate in harmony, right? Harmony, in that sense, I mean synonymous with that earlier term I used, homeostasis or balance. So some of those systems, just borrowing from Institute for Functional Medicine, where I did my original training, are things like assimilation, which has to do with the ingestion of nutrition, the breakdown or digestion and ultimately, of course, even the elimination of waste. But the whole process from the mouth to the other end of the digestive tract is one system, right? And then you have the energy system, primarily your mitochondria that produce energy for all your cellular reactions. You have your detoxification system, I sort of alluded to, but it's not just your alimentary tract. It has to do with things like when you sleep, we have this glymphatic system that moves toxins, metabolic waste away from the brain. We have systems in our liver that convert compounds we're exposed to through something called phase one elimination or the cytochrome P450 system. And then we have to make those compounds water soluble to excrete them. So that whole process of, and not everything's a chemical toxin, because these systems existed before the Industrial Revolution. It's just that, we create metabolic waste because we're living, breathing human beings, but then add to that mix drugs, chemicals, all kinds of compounds, heavy metals, and we really have a challenge to that system. Hormones, in the language of functional medicine, are referred to as the communication system. And it isn't just hormones, it's neurotransmitters, it's cytokines and chemokines, the chemical signals that talk to our immune system. So that's a whole other system. The defense system, the rest of our immune system, the white blood cells that go on attack when we need to. So those are some of the systems. Those are the big ones. There's one called structural integrity, which is really like your bones, your ligaments. There's the transport system, how things get around the body. But the bottom line is, when we start thinking about things in terms of interrelated, cooperative, interdependent systems, what it also tells us, going back to Walter Cannon that I referenced earlier, that when there is a disruption in one system, the body can handle that for a period of time, but eventually it can't. Eventually, that opportunity of tolerance, of resilience runs out, and the body has to make a shift. And until we start understanding that these systems must work in harmony, and that the understanding of why we get sick is related to a disruption of these systems, and the framework that we use to get better involves a restoration of balance, a restoration of homeostasis, then the only thing we're going to be able to do in treating diseases is give people targeted therapy, i.e. drugs, that either just treat a specific symptom, or they might slow the progression of the disease, but they don't really get to why the disease happened in the first place. So the newest example is that in the United States, we have 2 fully approved, commercially available drugs for Alzheimer's disease. One is called lecanemab, and one is called donanemab. And these drugs specifically remove a protein from the brain called amyloid beta 42 that has been implicated as a possible quote unquote cause of Alzheimer's, with the idea that if we stop the amyloid accumulation, we will stop the progression of Alzheimer's. Well, turns out that's not the whole story. And so, yes, we make amyloid, and yes, it accumulates in the brain, but we probably make amyloid in response to a whole other variety of factors that drive inflammation, that drive oxidative stress, that contribute to toxicity and things like that. So if we remove amyloid, you know what happens? We don't fix the disease. It does seem to slow the progression overall by about 30%. But no, it doesn't improve memory. It just changes the rate of decline over time. And here's the real kicker, is I was one of the lead investigators in the large clinical trial that led to the approval of donanemab called Kisunla. It's owned by Eli Lilly. And on an individual basis, we had some people who received donanemab, and when this amyloid was removed from the brain, there is a theory that amyloid is actually a protective response to something or some things. So if amyloid has a protective effect on the brain and you remove that protection, some people take a nosedive and they get bad really quickly. So clearly, there is more going on than that. And the only way that we're ultimately going to be able to use these tools to their very best ability is if we're going to use them and remove the amyloid, we better darn be sure that we're working on a plan to address the factors that cause the amyloid to accumulate in the first place. And then we're protecting the brain. And then we can put the brain much more into healing mode and potentially cure that person's Alzheimer's instead of simply slowing the progression over time.
Wow, this is very exciting. Makes you wonder what kind of possibilities we would find if we kind of zoomed out like this and then maybe zoomed back in. Like, for example, in the case of Parkinson's, we're looking at it as this brain thing in the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia. But like you mentioned, there's things going on in the gut, there's constipation, there's things going on with the bacteria. There might be something in the heart. I wonder if we like really zoned in on some of these other systems in the body, we might be like, oh, I found something, maybe something bad that's going on, or a gateway into helping with this. But I think when we're so focused on one little organ, we miss so many possibilities. It's the same thing goes on in life when you're too focused. You miss things.
Yeah. Here, I'll show you something. And I have to fold over this paper a little bit to make sure I'm not sharing any identifier,
Yeah.
personal identifier. But I promise this is the real deal, okay? And I have two patients that are like this. But this is going to be the easiest one to see, okay?
Yeah.
So this is a patient of mine who came to me last November. This is the worldwide debut, Michael. You have it on your podcast.
I got it. I'm the winner.
All right. Came to me last November, progressive cognitive decline. We do an office memory test called a Montreal Cognitive Assessment. There's a woman, she scored 17 out of 30, in which 26 to 30 is a normal test. So she clearly has cognitive decline. It was a pattern strongly suggestive of Alzheimer's disease. In 2024, we can do a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. Here is her test. What does that say? It's probably mirrored, but
It says
positive.
positive.
And can you read that number?
Yeah. 95.
95.
Yeah.
So the worst score you could get is 100. And in the fine print below that positive and 95, I'll just read it. The patient has a positive amyloid probability score. A positive score from 48 to 100 is consistent with a positive amyloid PET scan. If it reflects a high likelihood of brain amyloid plaques, one of the neuropathological findings of Alzheimer's disease. The presence of amyloid plaques alone does not establish the clinical diagnosis, so that the amyloid probability score should be interpreted in conjunction with other patient information. Clinical correlation is recommended. Now, we had a medical history, we had a physical exam, so we had everything. We did the whole workup. She had Alzheimer's disease. She started our functional medicine program, Brain Tune-Up. Now, I will tell you that from the get-go, there was concern that she had perhaps a second condition affecting her brain. This is one of those rare instances, but the argument for that was pretty compelling. She had enlarged fluid-filled spaces in her brain where the spinal fluid is normally produced, called the lateral ventricles. She had changes in gait and balance, and she had incontinence. And this triad of cognitive decline with gait changes and incontinence of bladder suggests something called normal pressure hydrocephalus. And ultimately, that's treated surgically with a tube that goes in the brain and drains the excess fluid from those ventricles down into the belly where the body just gets rid of it. But mind you, I saw her in November. She started my therapeutic diet and lifestyle functional medicine program in November, and it took until April or so 4 or 5 months, to the point that we were able to get her in to the neurosurgeon to be evaluated. In the interim, in those 4 or 5 months, seeing her monthly, her cognitive scores were actually going up, right? No surgical treatment. We knew that she definitely had Alzheimer's. I showed you that, right? Her husband said to me, "Hey, since she's going to see the doctor to be tested and potentially treated for normal pressure hydrocephalus, comorbid with her Alzheimer's, and to evaluate that, not to treat it, but to just determine if she has it, she will need a spinal fluid test." And the gold standard, despite the fact that we can do the blood test, the gold standard is to either check up spinal fluid or to do the PET scan that I mentioned. He said, "Look, we're collecting fluid already. What are your thoughts about testing her for Alzheimer's again, just to confirm that the original test, wasn't some kind of false positive or whatever?" But mind you, her cognitive function was getting better. She didn't have surgery. She didn't have surgery. She was only following a functional medicine therapeutic program based, we call brain tune-up. So I'm like, yeah, let's do it. So we send the orders along. She gets the spinal fluid test. It is remarkably better. She does not meet criteria for Alzheimer's disease on her spinal fluid test. I was like, wow. Now, she did eventually get a shunt. This is that tube. But again, this is after she's tested for Alzheimer's, right? She has kind of a little bit of a rough post-surgical recovery, but she gets better. She comes in. I'm like, wow, this is just incredible. What are your thoughts about repeating the blood test? Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's do it.
Uh-oh, here it comes.
Positive, but what is her score?
Positive, but 50. 50.
And it says that 48 to 100 is consistent with an abnormal PET. So she has driven her amyloid protein levels down to nearly negative, very close to negative, reflective of, and by the way, her Montreal cognitive assessment went from 17 up to 25, 1 point off of normal. That is reversal of Alzheimer's disease. I have another patient. I know I have a piles. I'm a piles of paper guy, so I know I have it here on my desk. He sort of a similar story, not a real, like this other patient. There was some other stuff going on, but remember, all of that testing was before she got treated for NPH. In this particular case, it aligns with the narrative I told you about with these new drugs for Alzheimer's. This is a gentleman who came to me with Alzheimer's symptoms, very low, similar Montreal cognitive assessment score was like 15, 16, 17. I'd have to look it up. Very motivated, did our program, wants to do he's like, want it all. I'm willing to do it all. I'm willing to make the big commitment. Opportunity comes up for him to participate in a therapeutic trial for Alzheimer's, similar drug to the two I mentioned, called aducanumab, which did become available, then was pulled off the market. Long, complicated story, but ultimately was pulled off the market, not really because it wasn't helpful or wasn't necessarily better or worse than the other drugs, but because the company that manufactured the drug also had a licensing agreement with, by the way, Japanese company called Eisai that has lecanemab or Leqembi. So effectively, they had two drugs and they would have been competing with themselves. And Leqembi had already come to market. So like, this is stupid. Why would we spend millions of dollars to develop this drug to compete with ourselves? So they did stop that particular clinical trial. But the patient They started a trial called Envision, Envision. He was enrolled. It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, but we know because ultimately the trial was unblinded that he was treated with aducanumab. But again, the trial was halted. It was halted, okay, because the drug maker, which is Biogen, decided it wasn't in their financial interest to continue the trial. He should have gotten somewhere in the range of about 18 doses. He got 4 doses, so he did not get enough to definitively clear all that amyloid from his brain. But in addition to him being diagnosed by me by way of spinal fluid, because he was in this trial, Biogen, the pharmaceutical company, required that he have an amyloid PET scan and what's called a tau, TAU PET scan, which is used also in the diagnosis on the research side. We don't do tau PET scans in commercial medicine. But at any rate, without a doubt, this gentleman had Alzheimer's. He was randomized into the trial. He got 4 or 5 doses over 4 or 5 months. Trial was stopped. He came in to see me. He's like, and by the way, guess what his Montreal cognitive assessment scores were doing? They're getting better and better and better. And he says to me, okay, like, what should I do? I can't, the trial's gone. Are there options? Um, Initially, I said, hang in there because we may have some other trials going on and you're doing better and better. And so I want to be really cautious about what the next move is on the chessboard because, I kind of don't want to jinx the situation. Like he got his Montreal cognitive assessment also up to like 25 out of 30. So he's near normal as well. I said, but you know what? His name is Steve. I said, you know what, Steve? I said, how would you feel about me repeating or doing that blood test I just showed you? Now, mind you, he never had that blood test because we did spinal fluid testing, we did PET scans. There was no reason to do the blood test for him. But he's like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do this, right? So I draw the blood test. It comes back. You remember that other patient, her score went from 95 down to 50?
Yeah.
His was 25.
Ooh.
25. That is totally negative test. Totally negative. And we know based on the pharmacology of that drug, there's no way that it removed all the amyloid. And this man had done the whole brain tune-up program, been in the clinical trials. So what he really did is what I was posing to you earlier, which is it's okay to use these drugs if it seems, if that's the direction you want to go in, but you gotta, it's like, the expression, the solution to the pollution, you gotta get rid of the things that are driving that amyloid in the first place. So Steve did. He followed the program. He did the sleep. He did the nutrition. He did the movement. He did the mind body work. We took a deep dive into his labs and looked at where the imbalances were at the cellular level. What were his antioxidant levels? What were his inflammatory markers like vitamin D, like omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA? He got all of that stuff corrected. He addressed his hormones. And Steve has reversed his Alzheimer's disease 100%. 100%. Score is 25. So we're going to be making some videos and interviewing Steve. We have connections to our local television station. We're going to be on the local talk show, and we really want to get the word out. Now, am I telling all your listeners or viewers that every patient that comes to me, I'm curing their Alzheimer's? Absolutely not. As the expression goes, individual results may vary. But I'll tell you what, these two individuals were 110% committed. It's like if I say jump, you jump. You got to follow that diet. You got to dial in your sleep. You got to, and it's not like, we have folks, they come in and quite honestly, for your listeners, I charge for my services as I should. I'm a professional person, right? So they pay for these programs that we do we personalize these programs, and then they'll get, their neurofitness component, their exercise component. And then we'll follow up and I'll say, well, how's the neurofitness come along? They're like, well, I walk. Okay. Well, you walk. That's good. That's cool. Are you doing the program? Well, I walk. Right. No, that's good, but that's not enough, right? So, what you put in may be what you get out. Surprise, surprise, right? So at any rate, my take home message here is disease reversal is possible. And we have objective evidence that we have done this now with 2 patients. In addition, we have published the largest ever case series of 100 cases of reversal of cognitive decline, where we're showing that the program that we put folks through that is personalized, individualized, results in improvements in cognitive function that meet or exceed the best drugs out there. And the good news is, if you want to use the meds, you can still use the meds so you can get the best of both worlds and maybe get a better result, right? But now we know that reversal of cognitive decline is not just improvement on a pencil and paper test, but it's actual disease reversal. And these are happening. And I'm not the only one who's ever shown this, but I'm one of the very, very few who has objectively, measurably shown that this disease can be reversed. And we can do it with Alzheimer's, we can do it with Parkinson's, we can do it with ALS, we can certainly do it with multiple sclerosis.
Wow. Way to send it home with a hopeful message. I had no idea. I had no idea that's even possible. Even just one or two, and you said, 100 or so examples of maybe not complete reversal, but significant improvements. But even just one example of reversal. Ooh, okay, we found something here. And I imagine there's going to be more and more. So, wow, this is very exciting. If people want to learn more, you have a book, The Healthy Brain Toolbox. They can get that wherever. You have a program, the Brain Tune-Up. Yeah, where do you suggest people go to learn more about all this, or to connect with you, or any of that?
Yeah, Healthy Brain Toolbox is available on Amazon and other booksellers. We do sell it through our website a little cheaper than you'd buy it on Amazon. You can type in Healthy Brain Toolbox as oneword.com, and it'll take you right to the book page on our website. But the website itself, the homepage, if you will, is functionalmedicine.doctor. And from there, you can explore all the different things that we do, and you can certainly fill out a little form and schedule a complimentary consult with one of my team members so we can learn a little bit about your needs, what you want to accomplish, whether we can work together. Does it seem like a good fit? We do not charge for that, of course. And then we would certainly invite you to come to Ozark, Missouri. So I am a licensed physician, and license is by state. So I cannot treat people solely remotely. But once they've made a visit to Ozark, Missouri, we do allow for some telemedicine visits. People do come from around the world, and certainly around the United States. So you're not jumping on a plane every single month, of course. But we do need to see in Missouri to establish what's called a legal place of service, and then see people in person at a bare minimum once a year. But all that gets worked out. Believe me, I'm very strong, very traditional doctor in the sense that I believe in presence. I believe in that energy that happens when, we're sitting together in a room and connecting, whether that's in the practice of medicine or that's a friendship, a connection that you feel with someone. There's very strong healing that goes with that energy. So I would tell folks, if these are serious diseases, this is not just I want a little help fixing my gut, which I understand, gut health is very, very important, of course. But if you have Alzheimer's disease, you have Parkinson's, you have ALS, don't cut corners. Come see me. Come to the doctor. Do the work. This is your life, right? There are no simple solutions. So definitely check out the website. We've got YouTube channel, Facebook, all that stuff as well. But functionalmedicine.doctor and make an appointment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharlin. I learned a lot. This gets me excited about improving my own brain. Yeah, thank you so much. Keep in touch.
I sure will. Let me know if you need anything. And when you've got everything, posted or whatever, send me the link and we'll promote your podcast.